want to tell us what the city has planned for this year's FCM meeting? It sounds like there's going to be a bit of a push in terms of the energy industry.
Yeah, you may recall that before the holidays, we talked about how the city could even more actively and vocally support Canadian energy, and in particular infrastructure and pipelines. And so one of the thoughts at that time had been to utilize the Federation of Canadian Municipalities annual meeting, which happens in late May or early June. And you get thousands of delegates from all over the country to really talk about the importance of energy from a national perspective. And so we're talking now about how to do that. And how to invite some of the advocacy groups like CAP or the Canadian Energy Pipelines Association into that conversation, because ultimately municipal politicians from across the country are the front lines of politics in the country, and it's important that they be well informed.
So is there a cost to this in terms of what we heard this morning, hospitality, in the trade show, that type of thing? Or is it something that the city is going to turn to private sector and say, help us finance this?
Well, I mean, largely we're going anyway. And so additional costs I think would be pretty small. I don't think the city of Calgary should have a hospitality suite, but I think if, CAP or SEPA wanted to put one there, we can certainly help them figure out how to do that.
And would you like all members of council to attend this year? Or?
I always appreciate as many members of council coming to these things as possible, because I actually think it's a good opportunity for members of council both to advocate for our position on things, but also for them to learn from others, and creating those relationships can be very helpful.
I also had some questions for you about campaign finance.
Oh my gosh, okay.
You don't seem to be a terribly big fan of this legislation.
No, that's not the case. I'm really happy that it's come through. I'm really happy that we've made some changes to start removing the corrosive effect of big money in local elections. As you know, this is something I've been pushing for long before I was mayor. Probably 15 years I've been working on this particular issue. The challenge is that legislation as passed still has one or two odd aspects to it, and in particular, I continue to think that the idea that you can cap the donations per donor instead of per candidate will be extremely hard to enforce across a province where you're going to have thousands of candidates. So what it says now is that Naheed Nenshi can give $4,000 cumulative to every candidate. So how would someone running for council in Ward 9 in Calgary know if that donor has already given money to somebody running in Spruce Grove? I think that's going to be very hard to suss out.
So when you use the words crappy legislation, what were you referring to?
So that's one problem with it. That's really the biggest problem. They fixed a couple of the other problems with amendment, but by and large, it's much better than what we have now, and I want to be clear about that.
What's your interest in terms of council perhaps passing something that relates to the disclosure of campaign donations prior to an election?
I wish that the province had just mandated that. I think it's really, really important that before you cast your ballot, you know who's been giving money to the candidates that you cast your ballot for. So as soon as it becomes clear how to do that, I will bring a notice of motion to council suggesting that we implement that for Calgary elections.
You folks discussed provincial election and strategies and advocacy. What are your thoughts about the prospect of a new government that will almost certainly likely pledge to cut spending, want to start retiring the debt as opposed to adding the debt, basically having somewhat of an austerity, at least a more austerity program than the current government? What do you think of the prospects of that?
There are certainly ways to cut spending and reduce debt without going to austerity. I'll give you an example. The city of Calgary. I'm a debt hawk, and we have been really working to bring our debt down to create capacity for doing things such as the Green Line. I've had 5 premiers and 9 ministers of municipal affairs in the 8 years I've been here. I wear purple every day because it's red and blue. I can work with anybody.
On the booze issue, I know it doesn't affect you personally, but your thoughts on allowing alcohol consumption in city parks?
I just adore Councillor Craw's characterization of this. European-style beer cafes, the opportunity to sip a fine Chablis with your picnic, the ability to sip on a exquisite local craft brew after a spot of crickets. Okay, we're talking about slow pitch games and so on. I'm happy to have this conversation. You know, I'm not someone who drinks myself, but you know, if people are discreet, if people are thoughtful, certainly we don't want to have drunk and disorderly behavior in parks that are used by families, by children, and so on. But you know, given that sometimes you got to recognize what's actually happening, and you've got to put your enforcement dollars where enforcement dollars can be better used, I'm really happy to see what the public has to say on this.
Are you concerned that, you know, the utopian ideal of the bicycle with the brown basket, the bottle of wine, and the baguette is replaced by a bag of chips and a 2-4?
Didn't I just answer that question when I started?
He's giving you a few more lines.
I'll give you a few more.
That's a good line too. I like that very much. You know, as much as I bug Councillor Carra about his relative elitism, I think he's actually talking about a bag of chips and a 2-4.
So,
But not a 2-4, maybe a beer.
like, is it, you know, we were talking with the city official who says it has to be at a picnic table. And then you're concerned, what about this picnic table being close to playground equipment where the kids are, that type of thing?
I think what's important for us to recognize in all of this is that what we're thinking about primarily is your impact on the park itself and your impact on the other people enjoying the park. I think that's really the criteria that we need to focus on here. So for example, the reason that smoking is challenging, or cannabis use or cannabis smoking would be challenging, is if you're drinking a glass of wine on your picnic blanket, you're not making the person on the next picnic blanket drunk. And so, you know, when you're talking about smoke drifting and so on, that's a real big problem for me, and that's something that I want to keep out of our parks as best we can. If, on the other hand, you're talking about people who are restricted to their own enjoyment and they're not impacting on others, then I'm willing to be much more flexible about that.
Could you give us a small Nenshi campaign finance update? Did you manage to pay off the debt, close the gap?
This is, I wish I could. So what ended up happening on that, I don't know if this is interesting or not, is that actually in a very, very short period of time, we managed to raise a very large amount of money from very small donors, which is not what I was expecting to happen. But Royal Assent was granted quite quickly, which is not what I was expecting, so we had to stop at the moment Royal Assent was granted. But I have assurances that the minister understands this is a problem that affects some people across the province, and he does have the power under the new legislation to do regulations to allow to fix this little transitional problem with people who have deficits going into the new legislation. So I'm just waiting on that now to be able to close the books.
So likely the debt was closed. Are you concerned you might have to give some donations back, though?
But no, I won't have to give any back because
Okay.
I was very, very careful to follow the new rules that were in place in that 1 or 2 week period. I don't think we raised quite enough to close the deficit, but I don't want to close the books until I see the regulations.
Just to be clear, I know you've talked about this liquor in parks. Are you actually in favor or against? I know you said you want to hear from Calgarians, and that's a good thing.
Well, we're in
but
the
what is your sense of where you land on it personally as one Calgarian? What is your opinion?
I do want to hear from Calgarians because,
Right.
as you know, it's an area that I am not familiar with, shall we say. I don't drink, and I've never been on a slow pitch team. So I really want to hear whether people think there's a problem here to be solved or not, and if there are common sense regulations that come out of it. So I'm very open-minded on it.